Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about something that many people often experience, but few truly understand. What happens when you go silent on a woman? When you stop calling, texting, checking in, or trying to get her attention? Now, before we dive in, I want you to know this isn't about games. It's about awareness, self-respect, and emotional intelligence. Because silence is powerful, and when used wisely, it tells a story louder than words ever could. Whether she was fully invested or only mildly interested, the moment you go silent, she will notice. It's not about whether she loved you or just liked the attention. Human psychology is wired to notice what's no longer present. When someone who used to be a part of your daily rhythm disappears, even if that person wasn't always central, their absence still causes a shift. It's a pause in the flow, and that pause creates space for thoughts to arise. She may not run to call you or text you immediately, but something changes internally. She feels the disruption, even if it's subtle. At first, it might come as surprise or even relief, depending on the dynamics of the connection. But after that initial moment, the silence begins to grow louder in her mind. The questions begin to swirl, not always consciously, but they're there. Wait, did he just stop talking to me? He used to check on me every morning. Why didn't he reply? The longer the silence lasts, the more she notices it. It becomes harder to ignore. We live in a time where people are used to constant stimulation and interaction. When someone pulls back their energy, especially when they used to give it freely, it causes a mental and emotional disruption. Even if she's busy with her life, even if she's talking to other people, there will be a moment, likely in the quiet of the night or during a random break in the day, where she'll feel the shift. It's in that moment that your absence becomes powerful. This is especially true if you were consistent. If you were someone who checked in regularly, shared your thoughts, asked about her day, and gave her emotional presence, your disappearance won't just be noticed, it will echo. And that echo will lead her to think about why it's happening. She might try to convince herself that she doesn't care, that she's unbothered. But emotion doesn't work that way. We don't miss the person. We miss the feeling, the comfort, the attention, the validation. When all of that is suddenly gone, it shakes things up. It doesn't matter how confident or indifferent she appeared before. If she had even a small emotional investment in the connection, your silence begins to take up space in her mind in ways words never could. When you stop contacting her, something subtle but significant begins to unfold in her mind. She starts asking questions, questions that can spiral in many directions, depending on how emotionally invested she was. These questions aren't always said out loud, and she may not even admit to herself that she's asking them, but internally, her thoughts begin to swirl around the change in dynamic. Why did he stop texting me? Did I say something wrong? Is he losing interest? Has he found someone else? The silence becomes the fuel that feeds her curiosity, her insecurity, or even her regret. If she had grown accustomed to your presence, even if she took it for granted, the moment that presence fades, her mind seeks reasons for the shift, because people don't just disappear without meaning. And whether she wants to admit it or not, she begins to analyze the situation with a different lens than before. In her own quiet way, she retraces steps, recent conversations, tone, reactions, and even the things she said that she didn't think twice about at the time. Suddenly, they feel heavier, more significant, as she tries to identify what could have triggered your disappearance. She starts replaying the last interaction, looking for clues, wondering if there was a moment where she misread your signals. This isn't about guilt. It's about her trying to make sense of a shift that she didn't expect. Women are intuitive, and while she may act unbothered on the surface, her mind will naturally begin to unpack the change in behavior, It's a form of self-preservation to understand and regain a sense of emotional control. This process of questioning also taps into her ego and emotions because your silence doesn't just signal disinterest, it signals strength, restraint, maybe even dignity. And that can be unsettling for someone who was used to being pursued. She starts to wonder what changed in you, what made you pull back, what you're thinking about, and whether you're doing fine without her. It doesn't matter how confident she seemed when you were talking regularly. Silence has a way of making people second-guess themselves. It's not about manipulation, but about the natural consequences of emotional detachment. When something once familiar becomes uncertain, the mind naturally tries to fix it, to decode it, to explain it away. And in doing so, she reveals to herself just how much your presence actually meant, even if she didn't realize it when it was consistent and easy to expect. As soon as the silence becomes noticeable, the ego begins to stir. Quietly, at first, but eventually loud enough to influence her thoughts and reactions. For many women, especially those who are used to receiving attention or being in control of emotional dynamics, the unexpected withdrawal of contact challenges an inner belief they've grown comfortable with. The belief that they are always desired, always pursued, always the one who gets to decide when a connection begins or ends. So when you stop reaching out, when you pull back your energy without warning or explanation, it's not just the emotional part of her that reacts, it's also her ego that gets unsettled. And ego doesn't like silence because silence can feel like rejection, like losing grip on something that once felt guaranteed. And the ego feeds off validation, off the consistent proof that it's still relevant in someone else's world. Your silence isn't just about the absence of words. It becomes the absence of confirmation, and in its place, uncertainty begins to grow. She might begin to tell herself that she doesn't care, that it doesn't matter, that she was never that interested to begin with, but those words are often ego's way of protecting itself. Deep down, she might feel confused or even hurt, but instead of showing it, the ego pushes a narrative of indifference or superiority. I didn't even like him that much. He probably can't handle me. He'll be back. These are stories ego tells to remain in control, to avoid admitting that someone else's choice to step back actually affected her. And in this space, her behavior can shift. She may become colder, more distant, or she might go to the opposite extreme and post more often, dress up a little more, try to seem happier or unbothered than she truly feels, all as a subtle way to reclaim the spotlight and remind herself that she still has power, even if it's just perceived. But ego can't live off appearances for long. The truth is that ego may react first, but emotion always follows. So while she may pretend she's unaffected, while she might lean into pride or confidence, eventually the quiet moments creep in, the ones where there's no one around to perform for, no one to impress, just her and her thoughts, trying to understand why your silence feels heavier than she expected, and that inner conflict, that tension between ego and emotion, reveals more than any words she could ever speak out loud. At some point, after the questions and the ego-driven thoughts settle into her mind, she will begin to test the waters, even if it's subtle, even if it seems insignificant. It might be something as small as liking your social media post, or watching your stories just a little too quickly, or maybe she'll randomly react to something you post after days or weeks of silence. She won't call it reaching out. She might not even be fully aware that she's doing it intentionally, but those small breadcrumbs are often her way of checking to see if the door is still open, if you're still watching, if your silence is truly final, or if it's something temporary. These little gestures aren't accidents. They are emotional pings sent out to test your reaction, to see if you'll bite, if you'll respond, if you'll break the silence first. And if you don't, if you remain grounded in your distance, she may take it a step further. You might get a, "Hey, just thinking of you," or "Saw something that reminded me of you," or even a casual message pretending to ask about something unimportant. The surface may look friendly and calm, but beneath it is a current of curiosity, vulnerability, and perhaps even insecurity. She wants to know if she still holds space in your life, even after your withdrawal. She might not say it directly, but she's wondering if your silence is a message, if it's a punishment, or if it's the start of something ending for good. The fact that she's reaching out in any form is already a sign that your absence meant, because people don't test for things they don't care about, and she wouldn't try to reopen the line if your energy hadn't left a mark. Even her silence can be a test. Sometimes she'll match your distance, not because she wants space, but because she wants to see how far you're willing to go without her. She might assume that eventually you'll give in, reach out, try to fix what's been broken. But when you don't, when you stay in your silence with strength and dignity, it challenges the idea that she can always have access to you whenever she chooses. And that challenge can either make her want to come closer or begin to truly understand the emotional gap your silence has created. Because testing the waters isn't about words. It's about the emotional signal that something is missing. And her quiet way of trying to feel that connection again without admitting just how much it's affecting her deep down. When a man pulls back and chooses silence, especially when done with grace and calm intention, something unexpected often happens. She begins to feel a growing sense of respect for him, not out of fear or confusion, but because there's power in a man who knows when to walk away, who doesn't beg for attention or chase validation. In a world where so many people are quick to explain themselves, defend their value, or fight for emotional scraps, silence becomes an act of quiet strength. It signals boundaries, it signals self-worth, it shows that you are not afraid to let go when you feel unseen or undervalued, and that kind of inner steadiness speaks volumes. When a woman encounters a man like that who doesn't argue, doesn't chase, but simply removes his energy, it forces her to reevaluate everything she thought she knew about you. She starts to notice things that she may have taken for granted before: your patience, your consistency, the way you made her feel safe or supported. And in the quiet left behind by your absence, those qualities start to stand out more sharply. The noise of daily conversations, minor conflicts, or distractions fades, and what remains is the memory of how you carried yourself, what you brought into her life, and the ease with which you walked away when things no longer felt mutual. That's when respect begins to bloom, not from what you said, but from what you didn't say. The fact that you chose to protect your peace instead of arguing for attention creates a shift in how she sees you, because silence in a man who once gave his all doesn't look like weakness. It looks like wisdom. Even if she doesn't agree with your silence or doesn't immediately respond to it, a part of her quietly admires it. She sees that you're not like the rest, not controlled by emotion or ego, not someone who clings to people out of fear of being alone. That independence, that control over your emotional space commands a different kind of attention, one that's earned, not demanded. And even if she doesn't say it out loud, there's a new lens through which she sees you now, one shaped not by your presence, but by your absence. It's in that shift that she begins to realize you are not a man who needs validation, but a man who chooses alignment, who values respect over attention, and who teaches through silence more than others do with 1,000 words. When silence stretches on and your presence remains absent, the reality begins to set in that this space you've created is no longer just a moment. It's a new atmosphere, one that either draws her in more deeply or quietly pushes her to detach. This is where emotional polarity reveals itself, because for some women, absence truly does make the heart grow fonder. The more she sits with the silence, the more she remembers not just what you said or did, but how you made her feel. Human memory is emotional, and when someone is no longer available, our minds naturally begin to idealize the good moments. She recalls the way you made her laugh, the warmth in your voice, the way you noticed the small things, and slowly those memories begin to outweigh the frustrations or conflicts that might have existed between you. She starts to question whether she misjudged the situation, whether she should have shown more appreciation, whether her pride stood in the way of something valuable. And in those moments, your silence becomes a mirror, reflecting back to her not only what she might have lost, but also the emotional weight you carried in the relationship. The silence makes room for her feelings to catch up, for clarity to settle in, for her to fully process what it means to be without your energy. And if the bond was real, if there was genuine emotional connection, that space becomes magnetic. She may not show it immediately, but internally she feels a pull, a growing desire to reconnect, to feel seen by you again, to know that the door hasn't closed completely. But this same space can also lead her in the opposite direction. If the foundation between you was fragile, or if she never truly valued your presence, then the silence becomes confirmation. She may interpret the distance as detachment, see your absence as a sign to move on, or even convince herself that it's better this way. Whatever it is, that distance secretly means a sign of weakness that needs to be addressed nevertheless, and the silence becomes confirmation. She may interpret the distance as detachment, secretly means a sign to move on, or even convince herself that it's better this way. And that's where the beauty of silence lies. It doesn't manipulate, it clarifies. It reveals whether she's drawn closer or feels released, whether she begins to long for what she had or realizes she was never really invested. The stillness you create allows the truth to breathe, and in that truth she either softens and reflects or detaches and drifts. But either way, you've handed the emotional responsibility back to her without saying a word. Time and silence work together as a powerful combination that reveals what words often hide. And as the silence continues, something inevitable happens. She begins to show her true feelings. It might come in slow waves, subtle shifts in energy, random moments where her guard slips, or more direct signs, like reaching out in a moment of vulnerability. The longer you remain silent, the more space you create for the truth to rise to the surface, not just for her, but within her. If there were genuine feelings, they begin to bubble up, often in ways she didn't expect. Maybe she was used to being in control of her emotions, or perhaps she kept you at arm's length, thinking she could manage the connection without becoming too invested. But when you pull back, when you no longer feed the bond with attention or energy, she begins to sit with the silence, and in that stillness the mask slowly drops. You begin to see whether she truly cared or whether her interest was surface level. If her emotions were sincere, she won't be able to pretend for long. Maybe she'll reach out more directly. Maybe her tone will soften. Maybe her eyes will say more than her words ever could. Even silence from her end can carry a different kind of weight, one filled with reflection and unspoken feeling. You'll notice the difference between silence used as pride and silence filled with emotion. On the other hand, if she was never deeply connected, if it was convenience or ego that kept her around, your silence won't stir much. She'll move on without pause, showing you exactly how little the connection meant. And that realization, although painful at times, is freeing because you no longer have to guess. This stage is where her actions speak louder than any text or call ever could. You begin to notice whether she starts showing up in small, consistent ways, or if she completely fades away. This is when you get to observe her truth without asking for it, because people always reveal themselves when there's nothing left to prove. And her response to your silence becomes more telling than anything she could have said, while the connection was still alive. In that revelation, you gain something far more valuable than words. You gain clarity, and with clarity comes peace, a deeper understanding of who she is, how much she really felt, and whether your silence uncovered the woman's heart or simply exposed her disinterest in ways she could no longer hide. As the silence lingers and your distance becomes undeniable, a shift begins to happen, not just within her emotions, but in her behavior. And one of the most common responses is an attempt to reclaim control. This doesn't always look dramatic or obvious. In fact, it can be incredibly subtle, masked behind humor, casual conversation, or even moments of manufactured vulnerability. But underneath these gestures is a simple, often unspoken intent: to regain the emotional upper hand, to pull you back into her world without having to directly acknowledge the power your absence has created. And this is when you might receive random messages that seem innocent on the surface, a sudden interest in things you never talked about before, or she might bring up memories or inside jokes that once made you feel connected. These aren't coincidences. They're emotional hooks, gentle ways of trying to get you to re-engage without her having to directly ask for it. At times, this behavior can take a sharper turn. If she feels like she's losing control or that your silence is threatening the image she has of herself in your eyes, she might begin using guilt, passive aggression, or even manipulation. You might hear things like, "I guess you were never serious to begin with," or "I always knew you'd disappear like the rest." Words that are designed not to express truth, but to provoke a reaction. It's not always about you. It's about her own struggle with the idea that someone could walk away without a fight. And when that happens, she begins to feel like she's no longer the one steering the emotional direction. And that discomfort pushes her to act in ways meant to restore a sense of power. But the beauty of your silence is that it puts the emotional conversation in her hands without ever forcing her to speak. It reveals how she handles disconnection, whether with grace, anger, confusion, or genuine effort. Some women, when faced with this moment, rise with authenticity and reach out with clarity and humility. Others, however, default to tactics that reveal more about their emotional maturity than anything they ever said when things were going well. And that's what this phase exposes: how she chooses to respond when she can no longer control the energy, when she realizes the emotional leverage has shifted, when the power dynamic no longer tilts in her favor, but is resting calmly in the strength of your silence. When your silence stretches into something deeper than a pause and becomes a deliberate act of emotional discipline, it doesn't just affect her, it affects the entire dynamic. And at this point, she will either grow or remain where she is, because silence not only demands clarity, it invites transformation. For some women, the absence of your presence becomes a wake-up call, a moment that forces her to confront her own emotional habits, her attachment style, and even how she values connection. She may begin to reflect on the way she communicated, whether she was dismissive, distant, or unavailable in moments when you were trying to build something real. And in that reflection, she might grow, emotionally evolve, and develop a deeper understanding of what she wants, not only from you, but from herself and her relationships. Growth happens in silence because it gives space for introspection. And if she's emotionally aware, she'll take this opportunity to become better, not just to win you back, but because she realizes what she could lose if she continues to operate the same way. But not everyone chooses growth. Some women will resist that mirror, avoid those deeper thoughts, and instead of evolving, they will retreat into blame, pride, or distraction. They might label your silence as immaturity, assume you're playing games, or quickly try to replace your presence with someone else's. These responses aren't signs of strength. They're signs of avoidance. Signs that the discomfort your silence created was too heavy for them to sit with. And that resistance to reflection exposes a lack of emotional depth, because it's easier to run than it is to grow. Easier to fill the void with noise than to sit in the quiet and ask why the void exists at all. This is why silence is so revealing. It doesn't manipulate, it doesn't chase, it doesn't demand anything. It simply allows the truth to rise, unfiltered and raw. You don't need to say anything, you don't need to argue your worth, because in this space she either recognizes what you brought into her life or convinces herself it wasn't worth thinking about. But the truth always finds a way to surface, and when it does, her decision to grow or stay the same becomes the final answer you've been silently waiting for, the one that tells you everything you need to know. When you stop contacting a woman, she will feel it, she will think, she will react, but most importantly, you will find clarity. Not every silence is meant to punish. Sometimes it's meant to protect your peace, your standards, your heart. Let silence be your boundary. Let space be your message. And let her reaction tell you everything you need to know. Because the right woman will never need to be chased. She'll match your energy, respect your effort, and never make you question your worth. Thank you for listening.